really beautiful to be here at Mindvalley and in Jamaica for the first time. And I'll sort of take you through my story and the work I've been doing. And for anybody who's interested, we'll have a longer time to share tomorrow. But essentially, kind of my journey started in my late 20s. I was working as a journalist and a magazine editor in New York, and I had a kind of a spiritual crisis or an existential emergency. Partially that was due to I'd started writing about ecological subject matter for Esquire and so on, and I began to realize that people really weren't receptive to sort of information about what was happening to the planet. And I began to inquire into myself and the people around me, and I began to realize that there was an underlying kind of like cynicism. And I began to realize that this had to do with the fact that we really had a materialist worldview. This is back the late 90s, so things have changed a little bit. And I realized that I myself was a scientific materialist. I believed in the scientific model. I believed that consciousness could only be based in the brain, and therefore there couldn't be anything like a soul that continues after death or anything. And I realized that was like a very limited perspective, and I began to ask myself, well, how could I inquire deeper into this? How could I learn if this was actually the case, or just interrogate it? And I remembered at that point my psychedelic experiences from college as the most kind of tantalizing and profound kind of indicators that there were other levels of consciousness, other levels of psychic reality that really deserved to be investigated. And I'd only taken psychedelics maybe a handful of times, mushrooms and LSD, but I remembered them as really powerful experiences. And so I decided that since I was a journalist and I was writing for these magazines, I could actually get assignments to go and travel to strange countries and take exotic substances. So I managed to get an assignment to go to West Africa to visit a country called Gabon and a tribal group called the Bwiti, who use a substance called iboga as their visionary sacrament for initiation. And iboga, I guess, is equivalent to ayahuasca. I assume, how many people here have heard of ayahuasca in the audience? So most people know about ayahuasca at this point, but there are other substances all around the world that different groups use, and the one in West Africa is called iboga, and it's the longest psychedelic. It's like a 25-hour journey that has a number of kind of like parts to it that the shamans there know really, really well. And that was really an extraordinary experience on so many levels for me. It was a difficult experience. We didn't even have a very good relationship with the tribe. We were working with a botanist who'd been studying them, and he brought us to their village out in the middle of nowhere. And when I took the iboga, you had to eat a lot of it. It tasted really horrible and made you feel kind of sick. And then they had you sit in front of a mirror, and you could see kind of like with your eyes open, you saw visions, like things happening on the mirror. Like I saw a statue of this tall wooden being walking across the room and sitting next to the shaman who he actually called himself the king of the Bwiti. Later on, I asked them, who was this wooden statue? And they said, oh, that's like the spirit of iboga who comes out at the beginning of your journey to open the gates and to begin this exploration with you. So everything that happened, they had this very profound explanation for. And yes, there were different phases of the journey, but a long phase of the journey was very, we could say, psychological. I was lying down, they were playing this music, and I went back through my early childhood. I saw memories from when I was very small. I saw my parents fighting, and when I was a kid, they ultimately split up. I saw illnesses I had. I just saw the way all these different forces had impacted my psychology. And there seemed to be a message with this. It almost felt like there was a guiding spirit or intelligence that was part of this plant that was showing me these different crucial aspects of my life, how I'd been formed as a person, to give me the sense that even though this conditioning had happened, I ultimately had the freedom to change it or address it. And I don't know if people here know, how many people here have heard of iboga or ibogaine as it's known in the West? Yeah, so it's actually being used now as a treatment for addiction, particularly heroin addiction, alcoholism, with a lot of success in the West. So that experience was very amazing, and there were other parts of that journey that were also quite extraordinary. As a scientific materialist, I didn't think that psychic phenomena existed, really, or was possible. I scoffed at it. But as I explored these realms, I began to have more and more psychic phenomena. And even on that journey, we did a second iboga ceremony with another shaman, and At one point, the shaman said to me that he could see the spirit of my mother's mother hovering over me, and that he said that she had died very recently, and that she loved me very much, and she was still hovering over me and protecting me, and there were parts of the spirit world that she wouldn't let me visit. And I found that really kind of startling, because it was true that my mother's mother had died within a year, and she was actually the only grandparent that I had known, and it just seemed that he was able to access this information from this other reality. And so that was like the first of what ended up being like a very long series of experiences that suggested that shamans were able to access information from a sort of transpersonal dimension, and that, that we have all sorts of psychic abilities that are normally suppressed in our culture. How many people here believe in psychic abilities just out of curiosity and have had those types of experiences for themselves? So I ended up going to the Amazon in Ecuador and visiting a tribe called the Sequoia, who use a substance called ayahuasca as their sacrament. They have an ancient tradition of using it. You sing all night with them in a ceremonial lodge in this temple in the middle of the jungle. And they really are able to kind of use their chants to guide you through these different other dimensions, these other realities. And in their language, they're constantly checking in with each other to make sure they're all on the same page and seeing the same things and so on. So I ended up going to visit the Mazatec Indians in Mexico, which is where we rediscovered the psilocybin mushrooms in the 50s and worked with one of the shamans there. And then I also studied the Burning Man Festival, the sort of psychedelic subculture that had developed, particularly in the West Coast. And when the book came out, Breaking Open the Head, came out in 2002, you really weren't able to talk in mainstream society on the East Coast in particular about psychedelics without being like ridiculed or they were basically just a very repressed subject matter. So it's been very exciting for me to see in the last 15 years how there's been a transformation, a renaissance in psychedelics, and all this incredible research is happening now that some of it you may know something about. For instance, with MDMA, which is also known as the street name of ecstasy. MDMA is now in phase 3 clinical trials with the government, with the FDA, as a treatment tool for post-traumatic stress disorder, particularly with veterans from the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, many of whom are suffering treatment-averse forms of PTSD. So they're veterans that nothing else has worked for, and they're finding that MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in 3 sessions is having something like a 60% cure rate. Which is pretty extraordinary. And really there's incredible research going on around psychedelics all around the world. The Imperial College in London is doing tremendous studies in, for instance, just looking at the brain scans of people on LSD, and they're discovering that not only do all these different areas of the brain light up, areas that are usually not connected suddenly start connecting in these patterns. And this is really suggesting that something like LSD could be very valuable for innovation, for creative problem solving. And it's led to, I think now there's a whole culture developing around microdosing. And if we look anecdotally, there are a lot of scientific and creative breakthroughs that have been kind of connected to psychedelic experiences. A lot of the discoveries in the 60s around the personal computer and the internet, a lot of those people were pioneers of psychedelics. I mean, Kary Mullis, who won a Nobel Prize for discovering polymer chain reactions, says that he was using psychedelics to get insights into how these molecules moved around and so on. So so we seem to be in a renaissance that's still unfolding, which is not to say that psychedelics don't have drawbacks or problems. Like all tools, they can definitely be misused, and I think it's important to acknowledge that and become more aware and understanding about the full spectrum of the use and misuse of these tools. So we can talk about that in more depth tomorrow. But when I wrote Breaking Open the Head and it came out, I think it helped begin to shift the cultural discourse around psychedelics. I was kind of shocked because these substances were so demonized and repressed, and in my culture, in the mainstream culture, you couldn't even talk about psychic phenomena without being laughed at. And yet here I'd had all these experiences, like too much to go into, that had verified that this was true. So I began to realize that there was really nothing I could trust about my mainstream culture, about what it said was important or how it had established its categories of knowledge. And that led me to write a second book, 2012, The Return of Quetzalcoatl, which essentially focused on the prophetic knowledge systems of indigenous cultures and their spiritual wisdom. Because I realized that we had kind of totally repressed the value of indigenous knowledge and dismissed their spiritual knowledge as just folktale or whatever, and that actually they had very profound understandings and insights, partially because they were able to access these other domains of intuition and visionary states and so on that we had basically just ignored or decided didn't matter. So that book was a long effort to kind of think about these ideas that like cultures like the Maya and the Hopi talk about, that we're actually in a transition from the Maya and the Aztecs say the age of the fifth sun to the age of the sixth sun, or the Hopi talk about the fourth world and the fifth world, and they really believe that this is an ongoing thing. I mean, 2012 was a part of the process, but it's something that's like unfolding in our time, and I think a lot of it has to do with this sort of reemergence of mysticism, of esoteric knowledge into the mainstream, people's quest for self-knowledge, becoming a cultural force, the rediscovery of psychedelics, the rapid evolution of technology, which has now linked humanity together into one global brain, which could allow us to work together really efficiently as we deal with the challenges that we're facing environmentally, and so on. So that was kind of the theme and the focus of the 2012 book. And as I finished that book, I was still left with a lot of burning questions. And that for me has really been like the sort of how my work has proceeded. Like each time I finish a book or whatever, there's like, I'm just left with wanting to know the next thing. And, so people talk about this being a time of, the new age, or that we're moving into the age of Aquarius, or we're in a period of conscious evolution, as Barbara Marx Hubbard says. But I began to feel that our way of thinking about that was quite incomplete, because there wasn't really a tangible action plan or strategy or an idea of how we would get from what we now have on the planet, which in many ways there's amazing progress. Many people are living healthier, longer lives. Yet there's also a lot of misery. There's billions of people still very poor. And we're facing these ecological limits, which are more and more clear. So that led me to write this third book, which just came out this year, called How Soon Is Now? And essentially the basic idea of that book is that we could look at the ecological crisis facing humanity as something positive, in a sense, as an opportunity. We could see it as something like a rite of passage or an initiation for us collectively as a species to shift from one level of consciousness to another level, to collectively reach maturity, to take responsibility for what we've unleashed on the planet over this last few hundred years of, let's say, semi-conscious activity. Does that make sense to people? Does that resonate? Okay, cool. So so that's one of the main ideas in the book, is that we can look at this crisis in a positive sense as a collective and personal and individual initiation, because we do know, and I know this is like a very positive and upbeat conference, and I don't want to like shift away from that, but I think we all do know that we're facing some critical situations right now in terms of the environment, and I do like to spend like just 2 minutes talking about a few of those statistics, because I think it is valuable to recognize that it's surprising, for instance, that we don't know them, for instance. So people know, how much biodiversity we're losing like every 10 or 15 years. We're losing like 150 roughly species a day out of 8 million species on the planet. So it means we're losing like 10% of the Earth's remaining biodiversity every 10 to 15 years. And obviously we can't keep doing that for too much longer. So we're going to have to shift our focus to replenishing the Earth, restoring biodiversity, and so on. Do people know about like ocean acidification, like how much more acidic the oceans are than they were 40 years ago? Like the whole body of the oceans are 30% more acidic than they were 40 years ago. And that's leading to, proliferation of jellyfish and so on, but also, the coral reefs are disintegrating, because as it becomes more acidic, they collapse. And so it's estimated by 2065, we won't have any more coral reefs on the planet. And they're havens for ocean biodiversity. So in every area that we look at, we don't know how much warmer it's going to get faster. We don't know how fast the oceans are going to rise as the glaciers melt. But we know that it could happen a lot faster than we would like to think, right? Like it could be 50 years we have massive flooding of our coastal cities. It could be less. And we've seen from the past epochs of climate change, when they've gone back and investigated, that you can have a rapid shift. And what happens is all of these kind of feedback loops get engaged. Like right now, we're seeing forest fires around the planet every year, and those forest fires are releasing carbon, and those forests which used to store carbon are no longer storing the carbon because they're gone. So that's kind of our situation right now. So that's the challenge that we're facing. Now, could humanity rally to deal with it, and how would we make a shift like that? When you look at initiations, on a personal level, they tend to be uncomfortable. Like we put ourselves out of our comfort zones to go through an ordeal. And through that ordeal, we learn really crucial things about ourselves, and we evolve ourselves. And actually, Joseph Chilton Pearce is a beautiful writer who wrote a book called The Biology of Transcendence, and he argues that initiations that you find around the world in tribal societies are not just cultural events, they have a kind of neurophysiological kind of function in terms of how our brains work, and that actually we kind of need to have like a culturally induced shock in late adolescence or early maturity so that we shift from being so me-focused to becoming more we-focused by having something like a transpersonal or a visionary experience. So what would happen in all these tribal and indigenous cultures around the world is people go on their vision quests. It might involve ayahuasca or peyote, or coca leaf. It might involve fasting or a walkabout, wandering alone in the desert or whatever. And then they push themselves to the edge, kind of like Wim Hof does. And through that, they have a deeper transpersonal experience and maybe even kind of visions. And they come back, and then there are elders in the community who interpret their visions, who kind of place them back in the society in a good way, So I guess I would suggest that we're on that type of initiation journey on a species level right now. And what would be on the other side of it? I think we could all agree that as much as there's so many beautiful things about our world today, it's also profoundly messed up. Obviously, we have Trumpocalypse happening in the U.S. That can't be good, and we're seeing refugees, all around the world and so on. So what would be the model for change? That's really what I explored in How Soon Is Now. And I think the easiest way to do it is to look at it in different areas, like the technical challenges. So we have areas like energy and industry, and agriculture, and those all would have to change significantly, And then, it might seem like the changes are so big that we really don't believe that we'd ever be able to do it. But actually, we have been able to meet huge challenges in the past, even on a very large scale. So for instance, the U.S. government, the United States, after Pearl Harbor, we shifted all of our factory production to wartime needs, and we taxed the wealthiest members of the society at over 90%, because everybody agreed that we had a collective enemy that we had to deal with. I mean, we're in that situation now. It's just that this collective enemy is of our own collective creation. It's what's happening with CO2 and biodiversity loss and so on. So with energy, we know that we have to make a transition to renewable energy. And we can't do it in 50 or 100 years. That's too long. We have to do it in 10 or 20 years, something like that. Is that possible? Well, I mean, it could be seen as a huge opportunity. And we are seeing, solar skyrocketing. We are seeing, solar reaching and grid parity with fossil fuels. We're seeing new storage systems being created, batteries. We're seeing the Internet of Energy evolving rapidly. So it is kind of all there, but it's still somehow going to take more than just simple market incentives for us to make a transition that rapidly. In terms of farming, we actually have to move away from industrial monoculture agriculture back to kind of no-till agriculture, organic permaculture, because one of the problems with industrial farming is it's taking CO2 out of the soil, and it's depleting the soil to the point where, for instance, the UN has warned us that in 60 years there'll be no harvest left at the current way we're farming. So that's, again, on the one hand it's scary, on the other hand it's like a huge opportunity for small-scale farming, for community-based farming, and so on. And we'd have to, and these other forms of farming actually they can sequester huge amounts of CO2 into the soil, which is exciting. And we also have to reduce animal farming, we know, right? Animal agriculture is responsible for a lot of CO2, a lot of deforestation. The Amazon in Brazil is getting cut down to turn it into soybean plantations for cattle. The only way to stop this process would be for a kind of collective social contract on the part of humanity to eat less meat. We would have to decide that, as much as it might be painful for us individually to give up something that we like and find ourselves somewhat addicted to, we're willing to do it for the sake of future generations, for the sake of our own children, and so on. I mean, farming, animal farming, animals, cultivated animals occupy 30% of the Earth's surface land. So if we were to cut down the amount of animals we're using, in that sense, that would be a lot of surface area that could be reforested, and those areas would become carbon sinks again. And then in terms of industry, we would have to look at how do we shift from extractive and exploitative practices to what the designer William McDonough calls cradle-to-cradle practices. Have anybody checked out his book, William McDonough? I love him. He's kind of in the lineage of a thinker called Buckminster Fuller, who's one of my great heroes, who really created a lot of amazing things in the 20th century, in the 60s, wrote amazing books. And basically, Buckminster Fuller's whole idea was that humans had sort of gone in the wrong direction when it came to how we were thinking about design, because we were thinking about, we were building things to sort of control or dominate natural systems, rather than learning from natural systems and imitating how they work. And now there's a whole lot more thinking in this regard. It's called biomimicry and so on. And William McDonough says, look at nature. It's like a perfect technology. Nature reuses everything perfectly. And really, maybe our design could ultimately function in the same way. So those are three of the technical, kind of big areas. And I just thought, it's important for us to have this in mind. And really, it's an individual decision. We all have our own choices to make. But if we look at the near future, I think that working with this ecological situation, doing what we can, using our genius to shift from a consumerist system to a regenerative system is something that will make us feel really good about ourselves and make us feel connected to the evolutionary currents, going into the future. In terms of our social and economic system, we have to also look at it, from a kind of systems level perspective. And I guess what I was trying to do with the book, and I know it's a lot maybe to take in, and I apologize, is really think about where we're at, almost like an alien anthropologist looking at our planet from another world or from outer space, and try to figure out, how we got into this situation. There's a really beautiful book by Bruce Lipton, who's an epigeneticist, and Stephen Behrman, who's a political theorist, called Spontaneous Evolution. And they really argue that we're in an evolutionary process, and as we've seen in biological evolution, there's a kind of transition from competition to cooperation that happens over and over again. And that humanity at this point is in a competition paradigm, and we have to transition to a cooperation paradigm, and we have to do it in a very short period of time. And so, for instance, let's think about corporations. If we were to think of humanity as a whole as something like a superorganism, a planetary superorganism that exists in continuous symbiotic relationship with the Earth's ecology as a whole system, then how would we look at corporations? In a strange way, I would think that corporations are something like the organs of humanity's collective body. I don't know if that makes any sense to you. But if you think about an energy company, it's like the blood or the circulation system that moves energy through the collective body of humanity. A media company is like the perceptual mechanisms, the eyes and the ears and so on, that are taking in raw sense data, and then they convert it into ideas, memes, ways of understanding, ways of contextualizing, that then tell the whole body how it's supposed to move. Right? A sanitation company is like the liver or the kidney in a body that's breaking down waste material and transmuting it and so on. So corporations are a bit like these organs in our collective body of humanity. They're distributing goods, they're creating energy, they're moving ideas and images and so on. But unfortunately, in the place that we're at now, corporations are a little bit destructive. In a sense, you could look at them as something like artificial life forms also that we've created, and they exist in a system that we've created called the stock market, okay, which you could say is like a game. And essentially, we took the corporation and we said that it has one prime directive, right? What is the one prime directive that a corporation has in the stock market? What's that? It has to maximize financial value. It has to, shareholder value and so on. So it's totally focused on this one aim of financial value. So if you look at it from those terms, then you can't actually blame a corporation for acting destructively because it almost has to. Like, British Petroleum, has to evade ecological restrictions, corrupt governments with lobbyists and so on because it has to, increase its financial value or it fails to survive in the game that we've created. So it ultimately, I think, is going to come down to the idea that we're going to have to redesign the fundamental logic of our economic system so that these incredibly powerful tools of transformation that we've created are not just focused on financial value, but are focused on ensuring the integrity of local communities, holistically assisting, supporting in biodiversity, and so on. And how we get to that point is an interesting question. But I think when we see what's happening with Trumpocalypse and the sort of crisis in Western civilization, we are pushing towards something that could bring about that realization. And I mean, I'm a big believer in things like the tipping point phenomenon, or what the scientist Rupert Sheldrake talks about as the morphogenetic field effect. There are moments that can be very surprising where we don't think that change is possible, and suddenly it becomes there. It becomes inevitable. It just happens. I mean, a good example of that would be the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed at that point. And if you go back then, nobody was predicting that the whole communist system was going to collapse without wars or nuclear bombs or whatever. And really what happened is subliminally people were done with it. They couldn't be in that system anymore. They took down the wall. The military stood down, and we went into this other system. Now, unfortunately, at that time when that happened, there wasn't any alternative model to kind of aggressive capitalism or what Naomi Klein talked about as the shock doctrine. And actually what happened is a lot of economists, neoliberal economists, rushed in to those countries and assisted them in privatizing their resources and created this kind of oligarchy, which Putin is now the most well-known representative of. So if we can see that we're pushing towards a similar crisis, maybe globally, in terms of how our financial system operates against the needs of the planet's ecology, then we can begin to get ready for that, and we begin to study and circulate new ideas and be sort of part of the antenna of the species who are creating the new system. I mean, one beautiful metaphor that a lot of people use for this process is the transition from the caterpillar to the butterfly in the chrysalis. And basically what happens is it's not like the caterpillar sprouts wings. It's like the whole caterpillar begins to kind of melt down, disintegrate, and there's a handful of what's called imaginal cells in the caterpillar that start to propagate. And they're holding the code for this whole new system that turns the crawling caterpillar into the pollinating, fluttering butterfly. And they're even attacked by the immune system of the dying caterpillar, but that just strengthens them. And suddenly there's more and more imaginal cells, and suddenly everyone's an imaginal cell, and they take over the caterpillar and they reprogram it into a butterfly. So I think something like that is the opportunity for humanity as we face this crisis. Does that make any sense to you? Awesome. Yes. And so what I would just offer to all of you, and I just got here, I'm just meeting people now, I'm getting a sense of this tribe or this community, but we're in a position of tremendous privilege. We're here together, we have the capacity to travel to different cultures, to meet each other. We can really play a tremendously important role in this transition, which is necessary for our collective future, and even for our happiness, because we know this current system, as these other thinkers have also pointed out, is really not producing like profound happiness, profound joy. There's so many ways that we could construct something that would be so much better and healthier. And I think in a different way, there's a lot of opportunity here to create these new systems and structures in all these different fields. I mean, for instance, One of the people I write about in my book is a Stanford engineer, James Ehrlich, who created something called Regen Village. And these Regen Villages are modular, mass-producible housing units that have, that you can grow your own food in them. They have aquaponics built in. They have renewable energy built in. They have composting built in. So you could mass manufacture them for refugee populations. And suddenly, instead of these populations just being trapped and dependent, they become, resilient. They'd be able to take care of themselves. Another person I know, Tom, I think he was actually mentioned earlier, Tom Chi from, Another person I know from Google has created a system called biocarbon engineering, which is essentially using drones to plant forests. So you could plant like 1 million trees in a day. So our technologies could come in great use to us if we are able to apply them with a humanistic goal and with a holistic understanding of how the web of life is so interconnected. And I think it's a great opportunity for all of us to be part of this. So thank you so much for listening to me.